think we're going to win it too.
On referendum day, was Jacques Parizeau confident of victory? The tensions in the sovereignist camp re-emerge. In the book, Lucien Bouchard reveals that he couldn't even get Parizeau to take his phone calls.
Just one of the many moments in Terence McKenna's documentary look at Chantal Hébert and Jean Lapierre's fascinating new book about what was going on behind the scenes the night Canada nearly fell apart. Referendum night, 1995. Chantal is in Montreal tonight. Bruce is in Ottawa. Andrew's here in Toronto for this first At Issue of the new season. And here it is, the book that certainly political junkies are talking about in a lot of different places. So Chantal, congratulations on this. But give us a sense of what kind of reaction you're getting, especially there in Quebec, where so much of the story is all about.
You know, Peter, when you start working on a book and it's 2 years in the works, you have no idea where it's going to land, what's going to be happening when it comes out. Will the PQ be in power with a majority trying to have a referendum? Or will they be, as they are now, out of power and stunned by a defeat that they didn't expect? The strange thing that's happening is this seems to open the way to have a more open discussion about these issues in the last referendum than we've probably had in 20 years. And I'm very fortunate, as is my friend Lapierre, that our book is coming out at this juncture. We did an event about the book tonight, and Paul Martin was in the audience, and so was Mario Dumont, and so was Daniel Payet, the former Bloc leader, and all of them discussing rather freely how the last referendum played out. I don't think that I imagined that an evening like that could happen when I started writing the book. It's getting great reception in Quebec. It's not a polarizing book, and people seem to find it informative.
You know, there are lots of lessons in there about our politics and the way our leaders talk to each other, even when they're on the same side. But I want to get Bruce and Andrew's sense of what's their takeaway, what they see as the important things that are in that book. Bruce?
Well, Peter, just before talking about the book, I just want to say, at the risk of embarrassing Chantal, this is an important book. These books are needed in Canadian politics. This is a small market, and so when people decide that they're going to invest their time and their energy in writing these books, we really should be thanking them, because I'm sure Chantal's book is going to do fabulously well, but she probably won't become fabulously wealthy just on the basis of these book sales. I think the thing that I was most struck by was what I remembered about the days when I worked in politics, and I worked for Conservatives and I worked for Liberals at different times in my career, which is that politics, every effort by political parties is made to give the public the impression, and the media in particular, the impression that politics is very well organized, very strategic, very disciplined, no mistakes made, all possibilities thought of and dealt with behind closed doors. But the reality is, behind those closed doors, it's usually a rollicking mess of unintended bounces, of mistakes, of human errors, of people doing things over because they'd got them wrong the first time. And for a lot of people in politics, that's what they love about it. But if the public saw what really went on behind the scenes in politics, and Chantal has shown some of that in her book, they'd realize that this is usually just a bunch of people who are trying to do the right thing, usually pretty well-intentioned, don't always trust each other, often have competing agendas. And so I think she did a service by shining a light on just the human factors in politics.
Andrew?
I guess just what a whole charade the whole thing was, not just in the sense that Bruce is suggesting of making it appear as if they were in control of events when they really weren't and were making it up as they went along, but even in the message they were putting out. Mr. Parizeau campaigned on a very different project than the one he actually had in mind, which was a unilateral declaration of independence, nothing to do with negotiating any partnership. Mr. Dumont now tells us he was never interested in separation at all. He just wanted a stronger bargaining position. Mr. Bouchard was somewhere in between them. Mr. Chrétien never actually said out loud that he would accept a yes as the mandate to break up the country, but certainly gave that appearance, and clearly, reading between the lines in Chantal's book, would not have accepted it, such a narrow majority. Neither, for that matter, would have Jean Charest, we know from the text written for him by a young Bruce Anderson. Neither would Mr. Dumont, he tells us, that 50% was plus one was not enough for him. So everybody was campaigning with a very different message than one they actually had in mind. And for that reason, among others, I don't think that October 30th, 95, if it had been a yes, would have triggered the breakup of the country, but it would have triggered an utterly chaotic period in Canadian history.
You know, I find it fascinating when Bruce says that there's a sense of a lot of what happens in politics in this book, that things aren't anywhere near as organized and as orchestrated as we tend to think that they are, that they kind of stumble around. Did you get that sense, Chantal, not through writing this book, but in your years of covering politics?
I learned over time, as we all did, that we start off in political journalism thinking that there's a recipe for the magic potion hidden under a tree that the government has control over. And our mission is to find that magic recipe, and then we will explain all that governments are doing. And if we can't figure out what they are doing with logic, it's because we have not found the magic recipe. And then one day you start learning that if it makes no sense, it's because it makes no sense, and because that recipe does not exist. But it takes a while for a political journalist to accept that there is no order, hidden order in the chaos that you watch. And in this book, it started on the first interview when we walked into Lucien Bouchard's cottage, assuming blithely that if you think you're going to win a referendum that night, a momentous event, you would all want to have your act together as to what you say in the first few minutes after you win, and discovering, on the contrary, that you stop talking to each other.
Yeah, that part was stunning. It was really quite stunning. The other night, Terence's piece, and for those who didn't see it, I want to show just a 20-second clip of an interview he did, Terence McKenna, with Chantal, because I love this moment. Watch this.
Over the years, I've come to think that in Canada, we don't do well with our history, in large part because the main players were allowed to go to their graves without having them testify. So what we wanted, I think, essentially, was not to get definitive answers. We know we're never going to get those, but at least to put these people on the record so that Canadians who have not lived through this can look back and read this and have a bit of a sense of the flavor of the occasion.
You know, I think that's really true, and as a result, I want to try and get each of your thoughts on what moment in our history that you don't think we know enough about because the principals haven't told us enough about what was really going on in the background. Andrew, you got any thoughts on that?
Well, the one that comes to mind most recently was the coalition crisis of December 2008, which was a moment of high farce and high drama combined, I suppose. And we've got a pretty good understanding from the opposition side of things about what was the discussions that were going on there. We've got some understanding from Paul Wells's book, The Longer I'm Prime Minister, about some of the discussions in the Prime Minister's office about the events, but we don't have the word from the Prime Minister himself, who really obviously made the call. And you'll recall at the beginning of that tumultuous week, he was looking very down at the mouth, was talking about conceding or allowing the confidence vote to go ahead, and then we'll try and defeat them in the next election. And somewhere in the next day or day and a half, he changed his mind and rallied himself and turned into this lion at bay, if you will, in the Commons and outside. So when he and why he decided to change his mind, I don't think we're going to know until perhaps he writes his memoirs.
And perhaps the Governor General of the day, too, could tell us a few things about what was going on.
The conversation between them as well,
exactly.
Indeed.
Bruce?
Well, Peter, for me, it's not one single moment. It's a story that has been going on for decades now, and that is the story of the right in Canada, or the conservative movement in Canada. Really, as I see it, the fight for conservative ideas has been more often than not a fight among conservatives rather than with conservatives united and trying to convince the rest of the country to go along with those ideas. When I think about the history of the Progressive Conservative Party and the great successful efforts of Brian Mulroney to build a coalition that involved significant numbers of Quebecers that managed to bind those conservative voters together with those from the West who come from a more small c conservative ideological point of view. That's been very hard work for the conservative movement, and obviously people like Preston Manning have played a big role in it. Joe Clark lived his version of that particular hell in the Conservative Party. And I think that Stephen Harper has had singular success so far in bringing those factions together. But even last year, we saw cracks in that story emerging again. In the U.S., we see the Tea Party version of this. There's a smaller version of it in Canada, but it remains probably the biggest single objective for those who favor conservative ideas to longer and more durable political success.
You know, you mentioned Brian Mulroney. 30 years ago tonight, his first election victory in the sense of forming a government, the largest majority, seat-wise, in the history of the country. And the last time anybody got more than 50% of the popular vote. Chantal, you're, you know, I guess you've had your head so much in this story, it's hard to think about anything else, but is there another moment?
Yes. After 9/11, things happened between Canada and the US on all kinds of levels. We took all kinds of decisions. We went to Afghanistan. We changed some of our laws. There were pressures. I would like to know about what the Americans were really telling the Canadian cabinet over the one-year period after 9/11 and how they responded.
Why do you think it is, Andrew, that there's such a reluctance to tell us what really happened?
It's a smaller country. There's a tighter connection between people. People don't want to put the noses out of joint of people who are still alive. We don't have as much of a tradition of intellectuals in our public life as in the United States, for example. One exception, and it's a real disappointment, was Pierre Trudeau, of course, and his memoirs were very thin. You would have thought if anybody could have produced something more detailed and thoughtful, it would have been him, but he was really a bit of a damp squib. I think we just don't have the same intellectual tradition.
Did you have a hard time, Chantal, convincing them, you know, the Bouchard, Parizeau, Chrétien, to sit down and talk the way they talked?
I had a great helper for some of them. Jean Lapierre certainly opened Lucien Bouchard's door, and I don't think I could have done it without him. But what struck me, and it goes to Andrew's point, is when I first floated this idea of the book on the referendum, the first reaction from publishers was nobody wants to hear about the referendum because it wasn't a happy experience. Come on, do we not write books about World War II, World War I? I mean, on that basis, how do we learn if we don't go back through experiences that weren't happy and just say, well, it wasn't a happy moment, so let's just go somewhere else. And I found that very striking, and I'm looking at how, you know, the reaction to the book, and I'm thinking, in the end, people did want to read about the referendum.
Well, particularly, though, because it was a counterfactual. And in this case, it's not just a gimmick, as you sometimes see in books. There's a really important question that had to be addressed there. But I think it's, if you'll forgive me for saying, I think you get a much bigger response because you looked at what would have happened if it was a yes than if you'd simply rehashed, you know, the events of the day.
And I wasn't interested in reading myself rehashing it anyways.
Yeah.
Peter, I'm not sure that the issue is as much the reticence of the politicians as the size of the market and the ability of the market to kind of afford the investment necessary to gather and have these stories published. The politicians I know are generally pretty loquacious. With the passage of time, they become a little bit more loquacious. So I think there are a lot of stories that retired politicians are willing to tell. And I think Chantal's done a service by highlighting the fact that that a lot can be done by going back in time and talking to those folks who can tell those stories.
I've always thought that there is a market for the, you know, the untold story type story, of which a good chunk of this book is about, but also the sort of what if scenario, which also, and as Andrew points out, it's so important in this story. But in a lot of stories, people love the what if. You know, what if it's something else would happen?
I get a sense also here that there was a bit of the Bob Woodward phenomenon where Chantal and Jean Lapierre went to so-and-so and got him to talk, and then once you've got him on the record, well, then so-and-so wants to get his version in, and there's a dynamic that kicks in, isn't there?
To be fair to them, though, they were all. No one said no. Some took longer to say yes, but no one said no. They were all generous with their time. They all knew that they were not going to end up with this. They knew they'd have their own chapters, but it wasn't going to be the Politician of the Year chapter. And so they did take that plunge, and I'd say most of them were terribly generous with their time and their comments. So yes, they were willing. I agree with Bruce. They wanted to talk, and they talked.
Did any of them talk to you since the book is out?
Well, those that were there tonight, Martin and Dumont, and certainly did. Charest, I know, was happy about this chapter. I've heard about most of them. André Ouellette was also there tonight. No one has said that they were misquoted, which is all I really care about. They can quarrel amongst themselves. It's not my problem.
Well, listen, once again, congratulations. Good luck with the book. Book tours are always busy times and exhausting times, so I know you'll be on them. But we've got lots more to talk about, obviously, as we head now through until October of next year when the election by law is supposed to happen. We'll see whether that ends up happening. But lots to talk about in that run-up. Bruce in Ottawa, Chantal in Montreal, Andrew here in Toronto. Thanks much.